The bloodshed in the former Yugoslavia continued in the weeks between the San Marino and Monaco Grand Prix. The UN peacekeepers had finally managed to negotiate the removal of Yugoslav army forces from Croatia, though had signally failed to prevent the widespread killing and the driving out of Croat populations from the designated United Nations protected areas that were ruled by Croatian Serb forces, under the name of the Republic of Serbian Krajina. One report stated that in those areas, from a 1990 population of 102,000 Croats, there were just 279 left. In Bosnia, the siege of Sarajevo tightened even further, with Canadian UN troops tasked with keeping the airport open for humanitarian aid, but unable to stop the shelling of the city from the surrounding hills and the sniping at civilians going about their day. On the 15th of May, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 752, demanding that Bosnian independence and sovereignty be recognised, and that the Yugoslavian and Croatian forces both withdraw to their own respective countries and disband the various militia and irregulars supporting them. When that was roundly ignored, Resolution 757 followed 2 weeks later, imposing sanctions on Yugoslavia, the major offender, in an attempt to force their withdrawal and serve notice to Croatia that they might be next. As well as economic and diplomatic sanctions, Yugoslav teams and athletes were banned from participating in events. This caused a bit of a flap at UEFA because the 1992 European Championship was due to kick off in just 11 days' time, and Yugoslavia had qualified as group winners despite the rapidly deteriorating situation in the country. Fortunately, the runners-up in their group had been Denmark, and with the tournament being held next door in Sweden, they had fewer logistical barriers to substituting in than might otherwise have been the case, though several of their players did have to be called back from the holidays in a bit of a hurry. A year after the coup in Thailand, elections had been held in March, with the military National Peacekeeping Council forming a political party, the Samakitam Party, Unity Justice Party, and winning the most seats, though not the most votes, and forming a coalition government. However, there were soon protests when General Suchinda Krapraun, who had promised to step down after the elections, was now appointed Prime Minister by the new government, without actually having been elected as a representative of any kind. Protests had continued through April as the government played for time, but in mid-May, a march on Government House to demand Suchinda's resignation was stopped by riot police and the fire brigade using their tenders as water cannons. Soon there was a full-on riot, the army fired their rifles into the crowd and there were deaths. Official sources say 52 deaths, medical volunteers on the spot say over 100, but all agree that nearly 700 were injured and there were a large number of disappearances in the following days too. The government quickly placed the country under martial law, but a compromise was brokered by the royal family, and Suchinda resigned a few days after the protests under royal amnesty and promising to seek re-election while denying having actually done anything wrong in the first place. And the Indy 500 was held on the week between Grand Prix. Against the backdrop of the death of Jovi Marcello and serious injuries to Nelson Piquet, Pancho Carter and Hiro Matsushita, Roberto Guerrero took pole position, with the front row completed by Eddie Cheever and Mario Andretti, a lineup described as the best front row ever in a field with 10 previous winners: Mario Andretti, Arie Luyendyk, Danny Sullivan, Rick Mears, Bobby Rahal, Emerson Fittipaldi, Al Unser, AJ Foyt, Tom Snever and Gordon Johncock. It was also a field stuffed with Andrettis, with Mario joined by his 3 sons Michael, John and Jeff. Al Unser's son Al Jr. also lined up on row 4. And making her debut at 45 was Lynn St James, the third woman to enter the race, following in the footsteps of Janet Guthrie 1977-80 and Desiree Wilson 1982-84, so the command was given, "Lady and gentlemen, start your engines," as the pace car, driven by another Unser, Al's brother Bobby, got them underway. In unseasonably cold weather, Roberto Guerrero gunned his engine to warm the tyres, only to spin into the wall, followed by Philippe Gache doing something similar. So when the race finally began, it was Eddie Cheever as effective pole, only to be swamped by the Andrettis, with Mario and Michael going one either side, and the younger going into the lead with his dad following. The Andretti curse was already an established part of Indy folklore, and it certainly looked like it was coming true again, as both Mario and Jeff Andretti had nasty crashes that sent them to hospital with broken bones, but with 188 laps down and just 12 to go, Michael Andretti still led, now 20 seconds ahead of Scott Goodyear, who'd started way back in 33rd. A lap later, Al Unser Jr. took second, while his dad was being lapped by Andretti, only for the Newman Haas's fuel pump to fail and leave Michael stranded out on the track. Out came the caution, and the race would be restarted with just 7 laps to go, and the cars all bunched back up together. Away they went, and it was immediately a two-way battle between Unser and Goodyear, running right together all the way round. Coming out of the final turn, Goodyear zigged, zagged and made his move, but Unser took the win by just 0.043 seconds, the closest finish in Indy history. In a good day for the Unser family, Al Sr. likewise held off Eddie Cheever by almost exactly the same margin, 0.045 seconds, to take third. It was widely described as the best Indy 500 ever. It had certainly been the definition of a grandstand finish, but the race had also been littered with crashes, with 13 separate cautions totalling 85 laps, and Jim Crawford, Rick Mears and Emerson Fittipaldi all joining Mario and Jeff Andretti and the 3 injured and 1 killed in practice in being treated by Methodist Hospital. Safety changes would clearly have to be made before the 1993 race. And so to Monaco for the 50th Monaco Grand Prix, where Ron Dennis and Gordon Murray launched their side project, the McLaren F1 supercar, which had been developed along with BMW. An unusual layout with a centrally placed driver and 2 rear passenger seats. It was intended as a road car rather than a race car, but with no wing mirrors or front indicators, the car was deemed not to be road legal, so early purchasers, including Ralph Lauren, had to send theirs back to the shop for modifications before they could actually drive them. Elsewhere, the rules and regs discussions continued. Bernie and Max were still talking about a single fuel standard, but at Monaco a new body, the Formula One Fuel Advisory Panel, FOFAP, was launched, created by Egypt, Shell, Elf, Sasol, BP and Mobil, which had changed its mind, to apply pressure to FISA. Another idea was the banning of carbon brakes to reduce costs, but the main supplier pointed out that A, they weren't that much more expensive, and more to the point B, metal disc brakes just weren't safe enough for modern F1. Jean-Marie Balestre, meanwhile, brought together a group called the European Motorsport Alliance, representatives of the automobile clubs of 9 European nations, ostensibly to discuss harmonising motorsport within the new European institutions, but really as an anti-Mosley faction which included the British Royal Automobile Club, the RAC, which had supported Mosley's election. One big complaint was that FISA had suggested declassifying some of the national rally championship races in these countries in order to create new races in further afield countries such as Sweden, New Zealand and Kenya. All great places to hold a rally, no doubt, but notably all places which had supported Mosley's candidature. As befitting the 50th Monaco Grand Prix, and indeed the 20th anniversary of the arrival of Marlboro in F1, there was a lot of looking back as well as looking forwards. Marlboro-sponsored champions Denny Hume, James Hunt, Niki Lauda, Keke Rosberg and Alain Prost were all in attendance at a lavish reception, though, with the exception of Hume, all would have been there anyway with teams or broadcasters, along with Jean-Pierre Beltoise, who won a famous rain-soaked victory in 1972 in his Marlboro-sponsored BRM. Not a Marlboro driver, but 1958 and 59 winner Maurice Trintignant was also in evidence around the paddock, a driver who began racing before the Second World War, storing his Bugatti in a barn during German occupation, and was now 75 and enjoying retirement as a wine grower just up the road from the Principality. But there was plenty of gossip for this year too, much of it centred around Ferrari. Alain Prost's divorce settlement with the team had been finalised, so naturally the Italian press had immediately started calling for him to replace Ivan Capelli, whose crash late on at Imola seemingly had him under a cloud at Maranello. Tests between races had been conducted by Jean Alesi and Gianni Morbidelli, with Ivan said to be on holiday, which he denied, and at the Marlboro reception it was noted that Luca di Montezemolo was talking warmly to Jean Alesi and pointedly ignoring Capelli. If Prost wasn't a realistic possibility for Ferrari, then Gianni Morbidelli had acquitted himself well at Adelaide last year, while Niki Lauda was reportedly trying to get his protégé Karl Wendlinger the drive despite or until his contract with Sauber for 1993. But the big rumour about Alain Prost was that he was being courted by Frank Williams for a 2-year contract, with Renault and Elf both willing to stump up his no doubt substantial fee to have a French triple champion in their car. Ayrton Senna had also been fairly open about his dissatisfaction with McLaren's ability to give him a winning car, and was presumably also eyeing up a set of blue overalls for next year, while Nigel Mansell wouldn't want either of them as a teammate, especially if he went into 1993 as reigning champion. He would definitely want number 1 status. And if Nigel Mansell left, would Frank really want Prost and Senna? Who knows, but that one would have everyone talking about it for some time yet to come. The Lotus team had two of their new 107s available in Monaco, after Monegasque driver Olivier Beretta had shaken down a second chassis at Hethel. Despite what I said last time, they did actually only have one of the new cars for Herbert at Imola, but neither driver was entirely happy with its fast ride height suspension system, reporting that the car actually drove better with it switched off, while Benetton had gone back to the Series 6 engine for this race, feeling it was a bit more torquey than the newer Evolution, on a track where that matters more than top-end speed. And so off they went for Thursday morning pre-qualifying. Perry McCarthy was sent out early to do 3 untimed laps, still with his unfitted seat, before being called back in so they could use the car as a spare for Moreno. Roberto, for his part, benefited from his experience of Monaco to outpace the two rookies, Chiesa and Katayama, who both struggled to learn the circuit, and for the first time an Andrea Moda car made it through pre-qualifying, with Alboreto and Gasho ahead by some distance, and Chiesa scraping through by half a second over Katayama, with McCarthy having an official time of over half an hour recorded. Qualifying once again saw the Williamses in a class of their own, with Mansell and Patrese taking up the front row, and Senna over a second off the pace in third. Alesi lined up fourth, splitting the McLarens, then came the Benettons and Capelli. No surprises so far. Johnny Herbert, though, turned heads in ninth, with Hakkinen 14th, with Cesaris 10th, and Alboreto 11th. Morbidelli, possibly hoping to prove himself for Ferrari, was well up in 12th, Wendlinger down in 16th on his first visit to Monaco, and the Ligiers well back in 22nd and 23rd, having failed to get their setup right, ahead of Olivier Guillard, who'd taken a lot of criticism over his antics at Imola, with Gabriele Tarquini 25th, but possibly the biggest surprise of all was that in 26th place was the black Andrea Moda of Roberto Moreno, who pipped Eric van der Poel to the place by just 0.033 seconds. Sassati and co celebrated like they won the race, and every other team clapped them down the pit lane, while there was disappointment for Damon Hill, whose father Graham had been known as Mr. Monaco, having won the race 5 times. It would have been nice for him to honour his father's legacy by making his debut here, but he, like Chiesa and Belmondo behind him, just ended up suffering from his lack of track knowledge. Graham Hill's 5 race wins in 1963, 64, 65, 68 and 69 remain a record, but Senna and Prost had 4 each, having won every race since 1984 between them, and Ayrton was keen to take the chance of Prost's sabbatical to be the one to equal Hill's record. He knew it would be a tough ask, but he'd won the last 3 years running, so he knew his way around the track at least, and knew that if he could get ahead of Mansell, he could stay there. Mansell, for his part, was cautious. He'd never won at Monaco, but he did have a couple of notable accidents there, including crashing out in 1984 just 6 laps into his first ever stint leading a Grand Prix. So Nigel with a point to prove on the streets of the Principality, but maybe a bit of a mental block. Saturday morning saw the traditional F3 support race, a one-off non-championship affair, won by Marco Werner, ahead of Andrea Gilardi and Giampiero Simoni, while Saturday afternoon's qualifying session saw a confrontation between an increasingly tetchy and nervous Patrese and Bertrand Gachot. Passing Gachot on his last flying lap, Patrese pointed at the LaRussa's mirror, to which Gachot responded with a middle finger. A full and frank exchange of views followed, and then a warning from the stewards followed after that. Less leniency was shown to Flavour of the Month Olivier Guillard, who was fined $5,000 for throwing his gloves at the marshals who'd pulled his Tyrrell into an escape road when he spun at the portier rather than helping him get going again. Sunday was overcast and chilly, but there was no risk of rain, and with Goodyear supplying the same compound to everyone and saying there shouldn't be any need for tyre stops, it should be a straight race to the finish. A fired-up Patrese set the best time in the warm-up, and when the formation lap set off, it did so without Gianni Morbidelli, whose good work in qualifying was undone when something broke in his gearbox and he had to start from the pit lane. The remaining 25 lined up to await the start, and the hazardous charged to the first corner. And away they went as Mansell slewed left, while Senna pulled a great move to go up to second ahead of Patrese into Saint-Devote, with the second Williams now chased by Alesi, Schumacher, Berger and Brundle, then Martini, Herbert and De Cesaris. Senna and Mansell rapidly began to leave Patrese behind as Modena nudged Martini into the barriers at Portier. Already at the end of lap 1 there were distinct groups developing, with Mansell and Senna, then Patrese, Alesi and Schumacher, then Berger, Brundle and the rest. Soon enough the Williams' superiority began to tell, and Mansell pulled away from Senna, the gap 2.5 seconds by the end of lap 2, while both Wendlinger and Morbidelli pulled off with gearbox failures. Senna dropped right back into the clutches of Patrese, while Alesi and Schumacher were having a terrific scrap over fourth behind them. But both Ricciardo and Michael knew that passing at Monaco was never easy, with Ayrton and Jean respectively making their cars as wide as possible. Schumacher in particular in his first Monaco Grand Prix looked like he was either going to get past or stuff it in a barrier at any minute. Gouillard's Tyrrell gearbox failed on lap 5, which removed another potential hazard, and it really seemed like Senna was holding everyone else up, as Mansell stormed away into a lead of over 7 seconds, while Eddie Jordan's beleaguered team did get some TV coverage for a change, but it was only Stefano Modena dog-eared 192 being craned off the circuit after spinning and hitting a wall. Ken Tyrrell had thought his cars would do well at Monaco, and De Cesaris had certainly had a decent qualifying, so he will have been disappointed when Andrea went out with an identical problem to Olivier just a few laps after. And 2 laps after that, another dream was over as Roberto Moreno's Andrea Moda rolled to a stop with a valve failure on his Judd V8. But 11 and a bit laps was further than the car usually goes, and it had outlasted several others. Nothing much had changed at the front in the meantime, as Senna continued to stay ahead of Patrese, Alesi and Schumacher, and Mansell eased off a bit but continued building his lead. Monaco can get a bit processional given how hard it is to pass, but on the other hand, drivers who get impatient and try and change that often come a cropper. As if to prove the point, Schumacher had a go at Alesi going into lows, nudging the Ferrari, which would no doubt have spun wildly if not for the low speeds. Alesi instead righting the car and even keeping the place, though Patrese was able to pull away. There was a big hole in the bodywork on the left side pod of the Ferrari, and the team's mechanics were worried about radiator damage, but it didn't seem to be affecting him much so far. Schumacher wasn't the only charging Benetton driver either, as Brundle pushed Berger hard, 2 veterans who knew Monaco well but were also both keen to prove a point at their teams. They were also chased by a third man in that situation, Ivan Capelli, while Herbert was still running 9th in the new Lotus 107 until he pranged it. Off-camera, Brundle made a slightly ambitious move on Berger coming out of the tunnel and got his front wing trodden on and had to come in and get a new one, emerging 15th, which was already next to last by that point, just as Alesi's transmission faltered and allowed Schumacher through. Brundle set fastest lap as he went about recovering, while Schumacher was likewise charging in pursuit of Patrese, who was finding the rear of his car a bit skittish and wasn't able to consistently pressure Senna, and all the while Mansell was still cruising away in the lead. Alesi pulled off, the collision having knocked his electronic box sideways and caused the gearbox problems. It was a day for gearbox failures, in fact, with the Lotus 107's debut ending a lap later as Hakkinen climbed out of his similarly stricken car, which had been up to 8th, and then Gerhard Berger 2 laps after that, gearbox failure again, and all the time Brundle on fresh tyres was still charging, another fastest lap, and was up into 10th. Schumacher's charge by now had brought him up to the rear of Patrese's Williams, as Brundle passed Leto for 9th, then Fittipaldi for 8th, and set about whittling down the 30-second gap to Gasho. Schumacher, 12 starts, was stuck to the back of Patrese, 230 starts, but the Ford V8 just couldn't match the Renault V10 for acceleration, and he found himself a bit stuck. And then for a while things settled down, as Schumacher couldn't get past Patrese, who couldn't close on Senna, and Brundle slowly ate up the gap to Gasho. He got past the Venturi on lap 55, and Alboreto on lap 60, the Italian veteran apparently so surprised he spun on the way down to Lowe's, which put the second Benetton up into the points. By now it was getting towards the last stages of the race. Coverage cut to an unusual view, as Ivan Capelli had contrived to put his Ferrari backwards and up on one side, having simply lost it in the swimming pool and ended up canted up on the barriers. No harm to Capelli, at least physically, but Biscotti would be in short supply at the post-race debrief. And all this time Mansell was still cruising to a 6th dominant win. By lap 70 with 8 to go, the gap was 30 seconds back to Senna, but now he had a problem. His brakes were starting to feel a bit spongy, the car wasn't quite right. Next time round he felt his car twitch in the tunnel and concluded he had a puncture. Easing it back to the pits, he got a new set of tyres and a quick visual check. Underway in under 10 seconds, but it wasn't enough to prevent Senna coming past into the lead. On cold tyres, Mansell put his foot down to catch his rival, but first needed to dispose of Comas and Suzuki. That didn't take long, and now he had 5 laps to make up just over 5 seconds, and then, and this is the tricky bit, get past. Tyres now up to temperature, he shot around the streets of the Principality, reeling Senna in at a rate of knots, breaking the lap record. On lap 74, Senna came upon Leto, catching him just as they went into the Nouvelle chicane. Senna got through on the way up to Tabac without too much ado, and Mansell was close enough to bully his way through. and now they were together, Mansell in Senna's slipstream and Senna with 3 whole laps to keep a fired-up Nigel behind him. The Williams ducked left and right, clearly quicker, but unable to find a way through. It was edge-of-the-seat stuff, 2 drivers at the very peak of their game, throwing their cars around inches apart at times. The last lap, Mansell dropped back a little to gather himself for one last go after the chicane. Getting on the power through the tunnel, he was practically sawing the McLaren's gearbox in half with his nose as they shot round the harbour, but it just wasn't enough. Senna took the checkered flag by just 0.215 seconds to take his first win of 1992 and his 5th Monaco win in 6 years to equal Graham Hill's record. Señor Monaco indeed. Riccardo Patrese came in 30 seconds later to take the final podium position, with Schumacher still dogging his heels, and Martin Brundle took 5th after a fine comeback drive, and the final point went to Bertrand Gachot, a great boost for the Monaco-based Venturi outfit after just 6 races as an F1 constructor. Both Mansell and Senna looked shattered at the press conference, as well they might, with Mansell making a point of complimenting Senna's driving, while the Williams team had a look at the wheels that had come off Red 5 and concluded that it was a wheel bearing rather than a puncture, not that it made much of a difference. It had been a funny race, dull for long sections, but those last 5 laps made up for it, and in 2009 Murray Walker ranked the 1992 Monaco Grand Prix as one of his top 5 best ever races. Senna moved up to 4th in the standings, while McLaren retook 2nd from Benetton, and Ron Dennis could smile again after months of unrelenting bad news. Next up was Canada, where Mansell had lost out at the death last year to gift Nelson Piquet what had turned out to be his final F1 win. Nigel would be keen to get back in the saddle, while Senna would be equally keen to maintain his momentum and start the fight back.